What's up, y'all? It's Zach with Living Corporate, and you know what we're doing every single week. Every single week, like clock work, we out here dropping air horn level content for y'all. You know what I'm saying? And who are y'all? Black and brown people at work. And who else are y'all? Not black and brown people at work, but who want to understand how black and brown people move at work and how you can perhaps be a better ally to those black and brown people. So shout out to y'all. Shout out to our first and last time listeners. Shout out to our educators. Shout out to everybody who just, comes in, slides in. Shout out to the people who give us 5-star reviews. It's crazy because we have thousands of downloads a month, like quite frankly, like over 13,000 downloads a month. And yet we only got like a few hundred, less than 200 reviews on iTunes. So shout out to the people who give us reviews. We're going to have to create some type of program or incentive to get y'all give us some of these 5-star reviews. I mean, they really help us. I recognize and I appreciate y'all giving us the downloads. We need the reviews too. Anyway, I'm on a whole tangent. The point is, we have real talk in the corporate world. We do that by having executives, entrepreneurs, influencers, creatives, thought leaders, activists, public servants, civic leaders, educators, professors, musicians, pretty much anybody who is passionate about centering underrepresented voices at work. We have them on the show. Okay. So y'all have seen that we've had some big names, and this week is no different. Okay. Cause we have Brittany Harris on the show. Brittany J Harris is the Vice President of Learning and Innovation at the Winners Group. In her role, Brittany is responsible for curating and facilitating learning experiences that shift perspectives, change hearts, and empower action in service of equity, justice, and inclusion. You see that? Equity, justice, and inclusion. You don't even have diversity in this title because they out here working. You know what I'm saying? Brittany supports nonprofit and for-profit organizations in designing high-impact learning and education programs that focus on competency building around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and cultural competence, and meeting people where they are in their journey. Prior to joining the Winners Group, Brittany held human resources, diversity management, affirmative action, compliance, and consulting roles in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, and Tampa Bay, Florida. A graduate of Howard University, Brittany holds an undergraduate degree in broadcast journalism. She's also received her master's in human resources management with a concentration on diversity and inclusion management from Georgetown University. Brittany is a certified administrator of intercultural development inventory, or IDI. That's trademark, that's registered. Okay, so y'all can't be out here stealing that. Brittany currently serves on a curriculum advisory board for Baltimore City Public Schools Be More Me initiative, and has previously served on boards for the Florida Diversity Council, Women in Cable Telecommunications Florida, the Pinellas County Urban League, Young Professionals, and the Greater Baltimore Leadership Association. Do you feel the energy on this day? Brittany, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here.
What's up?
It's going
I just
good.
had to put a little mambo sauce on the intro real quick. You know what I mean? Just a little something. Thank you so much for being on the platform. Of course, we'll talk about the Winners a little bit later, but I just want to shout out to you. I love your profile.
I'm appreciative.
No doubt. Let's just get to it now. Look, a known headline today is that organizations are spending low end $8 billion a year on diversity and inclusion training. Would you say that diversity and inclusion training has been successful to date?
So that's so loaded. First of all, I'm gonna be honest. Like, I cringe when I hear the word training, especially in the context of diversity and inclusion, mainly because it does, and perhaps rightfully so, have a bad rap. The short answer is yes and no, and so I prefer, especially when addressing the no part, to use education and learning as the framework. So just a little context for the folks who are listening. Like majority of my work really is around education and learning, and so to some extent, we in business, because the Winners Group, who, hey, by the way, is owned by a Black woman, is because we stand behind the work that we do, and so we strive, right, to ensure that, like, we're creating spaces where transformation, can happen. I will say more broadly, because training, right, is this sort of like one-off approach. A lot of organizations are not necessarily positioning training as part of a much broader systemic shift or like institutional transformation. That's why it's not, one would say it's not working, right? A lot of times it is sort of positioned as, keynotes. And I'll be honest, we have clients or organizations come to us all the time just kind of wanting a quick fix, right? For purposes of, what is this, cover Black History Month or being part of some sort of advocacy organization or, wanting to, we got some employee resource groups. And so we want to make sure they feel like, heard. And so because there hasn't been as much as a emphasis on, education or capacity building is going to be part of a much broader effort in shifting the culture and institutional change. No. Diversity training hasn't worked, right? And so Pamela Newkirk actually put out a book that I'm reading, and she pretty much, with data, backs up the fact that, hey, and as much as this has become a really big industry, we have not seen shifts at the sort of cultural and institutional level, education, corporate America, so arts and entertainment. It's really just an industry that has thrived because it makes people feel good. And that has a lot to do with just like, we'll get into kind of my thoughts on how just the industry, I guess, since it's an industry, has evolved over the years. But short answer, yes and no. It can work. It has not. And I think that is indicative of us perhaps even losing sight on what the end goal or the main goal of this work is even supposed to be.
So my follow-up question then, when you say it hasn't been working today, so from your strategic framework, what are some of the key performance indicators of an effective learning experience or materials for diversity and inclusion?
Yeah. So one thing that I think we've missed the mark on, and so as I mentioned, education and training is really something that's at the interpersonal level, right? But equity work is like not solely at the interpersonal level. And so we really position our work or our education and learning around, taking a developmental approach. And so we're not necessarily training people, we're building capacity, right? We're actually skill building. Mary Frances, the way that she has positioned, by the way, folks, that's our president and founder, has positioned education and learning for us is we are not just going in and engaging folks who want a quick fix. We actually take approaches that are sort of developmental and module based, right? And so long term. And so we're going in, assessing, understanding where the organization is. We leverage tools, right? So we leverage tools to actually measure cultural competence, engage individual and organizational readiness. And that's how we frame our experiences. And so we're not just going in, no shade to the folks who love the flavor of the month, unconscious bias, but we're not going in and starting with unconscious bias just because everybody likes it down, right? We're really focusing on getting folks to understand themselves as, cultural beings, which is important. There was a study out a couple of months ago that showed that like white people in general don't see themselves as cultural beings. Like 75% of white people don't even like identify with their racial identity, right? That's not a bias thing, right? Like that's not, you can't sort of address that dynamic by focusing on unconscious bias only, right? And so a lot of times we're developing experiences and modules that focus on the cultural self, right? Understanding identity, understanding dominant and subordinated group memberships. And so getting into conversations around power and privilege, which is something that corporate environments have strayed away from, right? And so like the silent P in D&I work has been, power and privilege. And we've had clients who've pretty much said, no, we don't want to bring that up. I don't think you can have conversations without calling out the fact that a power dynamic is at play. We can talk about cultural competence and implicit bias all day, but if we're not adding an overlay of, some biases are more harmful than others, and some biases have more harmful implications than others, then the work is for naught, right?
So keep going.
Yeah, and so a lot of times we're going in getting folks thinking about what it means to be cultural beings. And a lot of times our audiences are majority white leaders, right? Male. Getting them to understand themselves as cultural beings, moving into work around understanding their cultural others and skill building around empathy and like differentiating and discerning cultural patterns. So for example, we get folks thinking about sort of, okay, where do our dominant sort of cultural norms within the organization come from? Like, it's not by happenstance or by chance that we value direct communication styles, or that we value direct communication styles in some over others. Like, what is behind that cultural dynamic? The notion of like individualism, right? Like, that is a cultural norm that didn't come out of nowhere. It's actually like a construct of whiteness, right? And so actually being able to like name where these norms, patterns come from that essentially build a lot of these cultures, right? Meritocracy, where does that come? You know, like all of these things come from somewhere, and it's cultural. But if people don't even see themselves as cultural beings and understand where their worldview comes from, not their biases, but like their actual worldviews that end up manifesting as behaviors and policies and structures and values, that they can't begin to act, right? And so a lot of times after we have framed learning around cultural self and other understanding and cultural patterns, we get into, okay, where is your sphere of influence and how can you begin to disrupt perpetual exclusion based on your role, right? And so if you're a talent acquisition leader, what does this look like in your sort of sphere of influence as it relates to talent systems, right? If you are a leader who is essentially, you know, charged with how values those espoused play out on your team, how are you enacting that in how you mentor and how you coach and who you are, what is the word they like to use now? Sponsor, right? Yes. And those, the word they like to use, go figure. You know, there's so much, you know, I love my job. I'm also very cynical of this work because I love it so much. So y'all will hear it in my voice, but it's not because I don't love my job. It's because I know that, or my job or this work or industry, is because I know that there is still so much more that we can be doing. And so that's if there is an undertone of cynicism, that's where it comes from.
Well, no, right? I mean, well, you're preaching to the choir, right? I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the silent P of power, because when I think about it, and I think about even like individuals that I've spoken with, right? Like I've had people in professional settings, right, who are literally formally supposed to be in a position where they're supposed to be like an advocate for me or speak up or whatever, and they ultimately turn into people just kind of whispering on the sidelines of how you can essentially deal with the oppression better, right? So I'll be like, hey, I'm being mistreated here. Hey, this is wrong, and then the response is more of, well, have you tried this? Well, I don't know what to tell you. It's like, well, no, what are you going to do though? Like you're supposed, like what can you actually do? What are you going to say? Like how can you leverage your actual power to help me? And that's where, you know, the conversations completely fall flat. And so I'd really love to hear more about that from your perspective on the role that power plays, not only in how it impacts folks who have the authority and social capital to speak up for you and help you, but also the role it plays in Black and brown people being afraid to speak up for themselves.
So it's so crazy. So I was having a conversation with one of my girlfriends who was recently let go. You know, this is going to make this connection. Was recently let go from a diversity and inclusion role within an organization, Black woman. And she reported directly to the chief diversity officer. And so sort of the impetus of what was her being let go from this role was feedback that she received from the individuals who she was supporting in the business. And by nature of the industry, these are predominantly white male. It's like a defense technology contract of sorts. Anyway, one of the pieces of feedback that that my friend, colleague got from the chief diversity officer was, who is a woman of color, right? Not a Black woman, but another woman of color, obviously has positional power And I differentiate her being a woman of color, not a Black woman, because when I finish this story, I want to kind of paint the picture of how even people who are in this work can perpetuate like anti-Blackness and exclusion, and not even know it, and perpetuate these power dynamics and not even know it, or know it and don't care, but that's a whole nother thing. Anyway, the piece of feedback that she received from this chief diversity officer was, well, one of the concerns is that your communication style is just a little too aggressive, and it is perceived that you like to like play up this race thing. In this exchange, the chief diversity officer felt as though, at least from the perspective from my friend and colleague, felt as though she could share this because she is a woman of color, right? Not a Black woman, but a woman of color. It's just shared experience, right? And right, this is a whole nother thing. This is a shared experience. That's not really a shared experience, but yeah. So anyway, she's like venting to me, and this vent is valid and necessary, and we need more of that. She's venting to me about this because she's like, well, dang, bro, like I started doubting myself, like, you know, like, am I tripping? Am I wrong?
That's that gaslighting.
Right? And so I asked her, I said, I wonder at what point this chief diversity officer and like steward of equity and inclusion felt it her role when she was met with this feedback by these business leaders to actually say and challenge, you know, these tropes, these angry Black women, she's playing the race card, all these tropes that she should be privy to as someone who's like a steward and purveyor of equity and inclusion, right? At what point I wonder if there was like something in her that felt responsible, like a responsibility in those moments, rather than coming to her and saying, you know, ultimately like the determination that, hey, you know, that you just ain't a fit, which perpetuates a whole bunch of stuff in and of itself. Rather than that, using her positional power in that moment with those business leads to say, no, not here, like not on my watch, right? Let's dig a little bit deeper. Help me understand like your behavior interpretation as to why you're, you know, categorizing or interpreting her tone or communication style or what have you that way, right? Like that's what like activating like your positional power, even her being a woman of color, but like a leader, a purveyor of like this work looks like. And so I take issue, and I do believe there needs to be more of leaders coming off of like the sideline of like espoused commitment and engagement and espoused values around inclusion. Like, you know what? Every time I hear something, I'm going to say something. Every time something is, you know, this doesn't feel right, I'm going to say something. Actually having a code of sort of agency or conduct for oneself. And so when I'm in any given situation, whether I'm hearing something, looking at a policy, discussing something with like my leaders, does this collude, or is this, you know, am I complicit in what the culture is, or am I pushing back? You know what I mean? Like, because there's really one or the other. Am I being complicit in exclusion? Am I being complicit in whiteness? Am I being complicit in inequity, or am I pushing back? You know, am I challenging it? And so I think that's what using one's, not even think, I know that's what using one's power on the day-to-day looks like. And when I heard her story, I was really triggered by it because, so before coming into consulting, I worked in corporate spaces, very traditional, predominantly white space. And I remember that feeling just kind of like as someone who was buried in the work and obviously responsible as a Black woman buried in the work, not as much like positional power, certainly also experiencing that dynamics of racism and sexism, feeling like, well, damn, is there anybody up there who like, you know, like who's being that voice, who's activating that agency, whether they are chief diversity officer or not, right? And so for, you know, white leaders who are about this life, right, in quotes, every day, like challenging it in your meetings, with your colleagues, when you're sort of picking out or having conversations around talent decisions and promotions and development. Am I being complicit, or am I pushing back. And so I think that is what using one's power looks like. On the flip side, I do think there is enormous opportunity to, and this is where I'm interested in doing more. And so obviously a lot of our work is centered around getting leaders, white people, educated, empowered, building their capacity to activate equity, inclusion, and what have you. I think just as much work, and I want to see this a bit more, is really figuring out a way that does, in a way that does not cause harm or perpetuate emotional labor or fatigue, a way that really enacts the inherent power in Black people, other people of color, to really begin to be the spook who sat by the door, really. Like, go in these systems and, like, take them over, essentially, in our own way, whatever that looks like. I don't know what that looks like, right? But that is my desire, because I don't know that everyone's going to have this mass exodus from corporate America. I don't think that is realistic. But I think, and would love it if we could figure out how to just figure out a way to not assimilate or assimilate into these cultures like a lot of these development or efficacy programs seek to do on the low, but really like go into these systems to dismantle them in ways that honor the whole of us, and also in ways that don't like perpetuate this emotional labor. I struggle with like empower, and so that's why I use I've been using the word more sort of like this enacting agency, or like the inherent power that's within us, because empower just sounds a little like, I don't know, savior to me. I don't know. But yeah, those are some thoughts that I've been having around like how just using power, how we can use power just more actively, and then also taking it back for ourselves. If that makes sense.
No, it does make sense when you talk about like this code of like of agency or being a change agent.
Yeah.
I think it also being a code of like courage, right? Because like the reality is like we don't have a strong historical record that advocating for Black and brown people, Black and brown, including Black and brown women, so all Black and brown people, anyone Black and brown, we don't really have a historical record that there's an incentive to do that, right? Like we do have an historical record that not advocating Black and brown people will keep you safe. We had Howard Bryant. You know what I mean? Like we had Howard Bryant from ESPN and NPR. He was on the show, and he literally said to directly advocate for Black people is to put your entire career at risk. And this is someone who's been, who's a senior writer. He's been at ESPN, over 13 years and been with NPR nearly the same amount of time. And before that was writing for major publications. I mean, highly decorated, one of the most senior and most decorated Black sports journalists in the world, period. And so when you talk about like this next level, and you say you're pessimistic, I still think that there's still quite a bit of hope in you, because like just to be in this work at all means that you do believe that there's
cynical, not pessimist, cynical, like cynical. I still even still, and I would say that I'm also a bit cynical as well, and just like, and like because I'm looking at the evidence, but at the same time, there has to be some level of hope between the both of us, because if there wasn't, then we wouldn't be doing it, because we still believe there's some capacity, or there's a certain number of folks, majority folks out there who are still at least interested in demonstrating some level of courage. But I think, the challenge has been so far is that, we continue to see Black and brown people marginalized. You remember that letter that those employees from Facebook sent out last year. And then a report just came out about the continued lack of diversity in tech, despite all of these little efforts. So I remember remember when the whole like calling out tech and diversity, this was obviously like years ago, when the whole tech and diversity thing was like a big deal. Like, oh my gosh, we've got to we have this data, all of them will put out their data. It's such a big thing. We're going to address it. I fear now that we're essentially normalized that the data doesn't change.
Correct.
You know what I mean?
Right? Absolutely. We've shrugged our shoulders at the fact that, we know it's bad.
We've essentially normalized that the data, the data hasn't changed. There was something you said that I thought about. I think a big part of this power conversation is also the focus on collective power, right? And shared risk. And so I think that it's a really, it's fair to say that, yes, there's a lot of risk associated with advocating, especially directly. We see it in the mainstream for people with socioeconomic power. And so even with Gab, right? Gab Union, kind of like,
right.
if you're going to be pro-Black, the White Academy will not have it. Which is why I think that this shared risk thing is so important. This sense of white people really being radical in their advocacy and putting their actions behind the talk around this work is so important. Because the reality is, Black people do have a lot more to lose. And when it comes to advocating in white spaces for our own well-being and power and reallocation of resources and all this stuff, which is why, yes, there is hope. There's still hope, and I'm optimistic. And I recognize the need for white people to take a more active role in sharing the risk. Not a front seat. Like, that's different. Not like, necessarily leading the charge, being the voice, but like sharing the risk. Which,
what does that look like?
I don't know that I see that. Like, so I'm going to give you an example. And this is kind of like it's something I reflected on. I observed a couple years ago when I was at a conference. And so, this is when I was working in corporate. I wasn't even consulting yet. And so I was at this conference and they were doing this, what do we call, like a tribute to like pioneers. These are like the tribute of like all these pioneers of diversity and inclusion advocates and consultants up on the stage, right? But this is before I started working for Mary Frances, but she was one of the women. She was one of the people up there. Mary Frances Winters was up there along with a few other counterparts.
You're not gonna drop no names.
Howard Ross, Deb Dackett, Steve Hannah Moore is up there. A whole bunch of folks, right? This is something that has stuck with me because I think when I experienced it, and y'all probably like, well, damn, Britt, get to the story. When I experienced it, y'all, I was like, this feels weird. And now that I've become more critical in my thinking, I'm like, oh, now I realize why this feels weird. Anyway, they up there giving a tribute to the Trailblazers, Mary Frances, peak Black woman magic, y'all. Doing this work 35 plus years. So shout out to her. She gets up and talks about her experience being a Black woman entrepreneur in this space, the diversity, equity, inclusion space. Mind you, room full of people who are about this life, the diversity, equity life. And she shares, even as an entrepreneur, she is still experiences, the stigma associated with her Black womanness. And one of the ways that plays out practically is she'll go into organizations or, bid for work, and clients will actually say, it would be better if we heard this from a white person or a white guy. It just will resonate better with our culture. This gets into like the whole how this even perpetuates like economic injustice, right? And so bidding for client, a Black woman-owned firm who's, essentially organizations who are wanting to espouse inclusion and equity would, she'd bid for work, she was sharing, and they would say, we prefer not to work with a Black-owned firm. We'd prefer, or our organization would probably hear this best from a white man or a white person. Like, that's a thing. I hope y'all don't know that this is not that's actual like thing. And that goes back to like the whole like we love us and we could talk later about the balance, but that's what I was trying to get at between like the balance between like shared risk and like feeling the need, like white people sharing risk versus like feeling need to be like front and center like in this work.
But I don't think those things can be compartmentalized for a lot of folks who are used to being in charge.
Mm-hmm. So let me tell you this. Let me tell you what happens on
Keep
this
going.
stage. She shared her truth. And let's just say anytime a Black woman gets on stage and shares their truth, like that in and of itself is just fire. Like that's boss, because we are oftentimes like either stigmatized or undermined or all of these other things when we share our truth. And she up on that stage and said it. And I'm sitting in the audience all kinds of like, oh my gosh, she just boss. I manifested working for her, y'all. Anyway, so she shares that, in the context of we have much more work to do. Anytime me as a Black woman is turned down for work because of me being a Black woman, in this space, there's still much more work to do. And one of her fellow colleagues on that stage, who is a white male, and so white male, when I think white male on the stage, I'm thinking opportunity to like activate power. I'm thinking opportunity to share risk. I'm thinking opportunity to really affirm the truth that a Black woman just articulated, right? His counter or response, perhaps it wasn't meant to be a counter, but the response was, well, as a white man in this space, I'm told the same thing. How would I, or how could I know, or, organizations tell me all the time that they don't want to hear this from a white person. And when I tell you, I'm a full circle. When I tell you my like stomach dropped, I didn't know or couldn't name why in that moment my stomach dropped. Because I looked around the room and was like, am I the only person who kind of felt uncomfortable by that? Like, I can't really name the dynamic that played out here. But I felt like that was an enormous opportunity. And I go back to like shared risk versus like being front and center. Shared risk looks like, you know what? Rather than me come behind this Black woman who just spoke her truth and talk about how this happens to me too, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to say, y'all, that's jacked up. And so all y'all with budget in this room who say y'all are ready to influence change and activate inclusion within your organizations and leverage vendors, to all of y'all in here who just heard this Black woman say that her voice doesn't matter as much as mine as a white man, that's foul. That's foul. And we can't hold both those. You know what I mean? We can't say that we are really pushing and affirming and wanting to create cultures where inclusion is real, but prioritize or not want to amplify or not want to partner with or not want to engage Black and brown people who are doing the work, right? That's what I wanted to hear, right? But I didn't hear. And so when I talk about like shared risk and what white people supposed to be doing, like incremental shifts, like that was an opportunity for like an incremental shift in the space to leverage one's power. And it didn't even take like a collective mass. That was like one moment for him to like say something,
right?
Or affirm and amplify. And that has stuck with me. That has stuck with me over this is probably like 6 years ago. And I think it's a really good example of the work we're not doing. The work that, because this again was an inclusion conference, the work that even practitioners and advocates, especially our white counterparts, are doing but not doing, how we miss opportunities.
You've talked around it a little bit, and you've used some language, kind of at the top of the interview. Can we talk a little bit about the role that justice plays in this work? Like what is, when we talk about justice, first of all, like tactically, how do we define justice in the context of this work? And then what does it look like to pursue justice in a capitalistic context?
Yeah. I've really been thinking about that as of a lot more as of late and more critically. And so when I think about mainstream like D&I work right now, like I can honestly say that, it's not right. It's not centered on justice. So when I think about justice, I think about correcting systems. I think about reallocation of resources. I think about sort of power, sort of dismantling like power structures. I think about actively like looking for the people who we haven't really tapped on for their perspective and these strategies, and bringing them to the center of conversations and the center of like policy development and the center of actually asking the people in our workplaces who are experiencing perpetual exclusion, not asking them like employee engagement, but actually engaging their perspective in a way that is not like tokenized, paying them for it,
and paying them fairly.
Paying them fairly for it. That's what I think about when we talk about justice. But that's not really, so I wonder if it's even, and this is after I was reading a post by a professor out of Bowling Green State, and they talked about the difference between like what diversity and inclusion may ask in how equity and social justice responds. Have you heard of Dr. Defina Lazarus Stewart? Have you heard of them?
No, I have not. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So tell us about them.
Look, because I copied and pasted some of the analogies they used. And so one of the quotes here they use is diversity and inclusion as stuff like who's in the room, has everyone's ideas been heard, whereas equity and social justice responds who's trying to get in the room but can't, whose presence in the room is under constant threat or erasure or minimization, whose ideas will not be taken seriously because they aren't in the majority. And so the way that they framed, there's another one in here, diversity and inclusion may ask, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Whereas equity and justice will challenge whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining their dehumanizing views, right? And so I wonder even if like how we have framed up diversity and inclusion even holds enough space for justice these days, right? I wonder if they can even, and it goes back to like, I mean, I know it's much deeper than like D&I because then it goes back to capitalism because now D&I is based on business case and innovation and bottom line.
Correct.
And I wonder if justice can even really thrive, like if we can even begin to realize it. So I think, I mean, now I know that this work is obviously beyond my immediate sphere of influence. And so certainly when I enter any room, my hope is that the people and leaders in the room feel at least more empowered to understand the role they play in realizing equity and justice. And so part of that is using very direct language. Part of that is making sure we're amplifying the experiences of the people who aren't in the room and how we curate content. But I do think that much more broadly, there has to be like just a shift in how we're positioning this work, right? And yeah, like that's something I've been thinking. Like, no one talks about justice in the context of D&I work, and that is the downfall, right? And that's why we don't see shifts. That's why Pamela Newkirk's book is pretty much saying, like, yeah, this work is a fraud, because we've lost sight of where it actually, or at least the intentions of where the work was, and so, or how the work started. And so, I would venture to say that diversity and inclusion evolves from Black people seeking justice, seeking for our humanity to be affirmed, or recognized, right? Getting what we deserved, access, and really using our lived experiences and collective power to influence change. And today that's kind of been like appropriated in a way, like this weird way, like of, now it's all about, okay, bottom line and how can organizations innovate and how can we reach these new markets? I'm not saying that we can't use that as a means to an end, but I do think it becomes problematic when that's what the conversation is centered around, right? Because then it trickles down to how we actually do the work. And that's something I struggle with these days. Well, that's something that I struggle with, yeah.
Well, no, I'm right there with you. And I think also because there's also just so much psychology, and I promise if I could have gotten to where I am in terms of having a house and like, taking care of my family and stuff,
hello, mm-hmm.
and also had a PhD in psychology, I would, because there's a lot of psychology that goes into the reasons why people in the majority simply just don't pursue the greater work of addressing and analyzing and assessing the systemic challenges that organizations have, the systemic problems that actually cause exclusion to thrive and that bear out the results of excluding Black and brown people. I think
when you say psychology, you mean like the why? You feel like the why behind it,
the why
is deeply
behind
rooted in things like just human nature,
ego, like MLK Jr. talks about, like,
yeah,
he talked about like it's part of white folks' inherent feelings of superiority. They feel like they have so little to learn, right? So a lot of that is just psychological to me, and so when you think about that, when you talk about like even organizations, how they're trying to present themselves as like truly like diverse, equitable, inclusive, but at the same time are extremely afraid of like litigious risk. So they don't want to like take accountability for their own behaviors because they believe in taking accountability for the behaviors would open themselves up to lawsuits where it's like, and so it's like there's a lack of diversity even in legal teams for these organizations and how they operate from a position of scarcity and fear. Like there's all these just different factors that come in, you know what I mean? Like, and so I hear you when you talk about like there being space, like, is there actually space for justice in this work? But like the reality is if you have two people and one has been treated inequitably, some type of justice is going to happen if you want to talk about creating equity. Like there's something that's going to have to be right sized or directly addressed. It's not going to happen during a panel or a one-off or an unconscious bias or a conference or unconscious bias training. It's going to have to happen in some substantive changes to corporate policies and procedures. And I think, to me, that's why this work, while it's been around for X amount of years, it's still very much so in its fledgling state. I mean, I could even make an argument that the work hasn't even really largely started. The Winners Group is doing a phenomenal job. This is not an ad, but like y'all are one of the few spaces out there that are really looking at that. Also, Michelle J. Kim with Awaken Co. See you out there too. But so there are pockets and these smaller, and frankly, it's always the women and Black and brown women doing the work, who are really leading that charge. But by and large, I'm not seeing it. So let's talk about this. You mentioned or alluded to the idea of white folks sharing some of the risk, but not necessarily being out in front. And off mic, we talked about the concept of decolonization. And we talked, and I've also I was talking to Ade on a previous podcast. This was like, she and I did an episode, this is some time ago, but she said she read somewhere that someone said replace the D in DEI or the D in D&I with decolonization. And
I think I've seen that one in a tweet or something.
Yeah, she was like searching for that thing. But I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on one, the concept of colonization, and then like why are we talking about decolonization?
So when I think about the concept of colonization, I think about pretty much adding like this overlay of whiteness like to our work. And so I mentioned earlier that this work was or is grounded in lived experiences of Black people, Black and brown people really seeking justice. And so I think when we start to get away from conversations around justice and access and policy and systemic change, and focus more on, money and cases and innovation and bottom line, when we start to prioritize sort of white comfort or white discomfort over systemic change or accountability or collective responsibility, that's what colonization looks like, or those are like manifestations of colonization. So I was thinking about a couple. So we support, and this is no shade, maybe shade, but I don't know. So we support we support a lot of organizations who are part of this cohort of organizations, executive leaders, CEOs, Action Council, CEO Action Council.
Okay.
In theory, that body of leaders, I feel like if they were really, 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 really about that work, I feel like that is the perfect breeding ground for some systemic change, like real change. I say that because you have a bunch of CEOs, I'm assuming because that's the name, CEOs who have espoused their commitment to inclusion and diversity, who have access to funds and structures and organizations and boards to really do this work and do this work well. I was on there. It's something I've been reflecting on, especially after starting to read Pamela Newkirk's book. But I was on their site preparing for a session that I was facilitating for an organization who was on it. They do a day of understanding where all of them have to do sort of conversations about race.
Yeah.
Sure, a good incremental thing. Okay, now you're gonna have education, that can't be it, or have conversations, that can't be it. So I was doing my little research in preparation for this engagement, looking up the mission and the pillars and stuff. And I did a quick, how you can do page search
Yeah.
Just the kind of a quick page search on very specific terms that, at least from my perspective, are quite critical to doing this work well, especially when you have power and resources. And so I like control search for like racism, justice, equity, reparation. This is me just doing a search and find on the page.
Sure.
Just to see if any of those words were present. And none of them were, right? And so like, I was kind of triggered by that because I think it gets at, again, this sanitizing, like, so very well-intentioned, like everybody, 98% of people espouse inclusion. You know what I mean? Like 98% of people perhaps consider themselves like good. As a matter of fact, there's a guy on our team, Travis, who like pushes back on this whole notion of what it means to be a good white person. And he says like, no more good white people. I need y'all to be bad, actually. Bad. Out in, you know what I mean? Like, he pushes back on what it means to be sort of good-natured in the context of equity work and justice work. And how being good-natured oftentimes means being complicit, right? And so I was looking for these words, calling out racism, calling out things like justice, or at least espousing justice, language around reparations that gets at how organizations can use the money that they make to reallocate resources, right?
Right.
And none of it was there. And I had one of those moments where, sure, kudos to whoever is on the forefront of this effort and the leaders who, you know, and actually, no, kudos. We got to start handing out diversity cookies.
Real talk, don't.
Like, yeah, like, no kudos. Because you're supposed to, like, right? Sometimes I got to check my own internalized oppression, right? So anyway. No, right? Like, sometimes we be handing out cookies. I refuse. Look, anyway. Look. So I'm looking for the words. Like, I was looking for the words, like something. And none of it
on it
was
now,
there.
by the way, while we're talking. I'm like,
you search and find, and you tell me if I miss something. Racism is not even on there anywhere. There's actually a statement that says, well, you know, we address all dimensions of diversity. Like, this, like, it's so all lives mattery. Anyway, I struggle.
So you feel like yo, this
that
hold on.
That model doesn't work.
Hold on. You feel like I want to make sure because we're about to get into a sensitive zone. So hold on. So your take is that CEO action is a little all lives mattery. I agree with you. I'm just asking.
That was the vibe.
That's the vibe.
And that's the vibe that I got. And I was thinking to myself, like, imagine if all of, you know, this coalition of hundreds of CEO actions, pretty much part of their chart on the website said, you know what? Racism is real and we are going to address it this way. At the root of racism is white supremacy and we're going to address it this way. We will only get to justice if we have some real intentional restructuring and conversations around how we're going to, you know, use our power and our money to support historically marginalized communities. Like imagine if there was like transparency around, and maybe, you know, I don't know, like, not in the inner workings, but like just transparency around, you know, it's not just day of understanding, but we're going to make sure that each of these organizations have a strategic approach to education. And you know what? It's not just going to be a focus on unconscious bias, right? Because that's, you know, at least outside looking in, there's this focus on unconscious bias. There's a mobile. Again, I get it, but there is so much more.
Have you been in the mobile?
I haven't. Okay. I haven't.
I haven't either.
I have seen it. I've seen it on college campuses, which is interesting because I'm like, okay, let's pull up at some of these board meetings. You know what I mean? So there was like a you know, they put at college campuses, and yes, we need to definitely educate and focus on the leaders of the future. I get it.
Right. What would a decolonized version of CEO action look like?
Getting rid of sort of the for lack of a better term, like sanitized language, actually naming in our written charter, because this is the written word. This is our written word and how we're going to govern ourselves, naming dynamics of power, naming dynamics of inequity, calling out oppression. You know what I mean? Actually decentering. Because so essentially when we sanitize, we're saying, you know what, how the majority or how white people feel matters more than moving the work forward. And so I think the ideal state would be decentering, like abandoning that train of thought for purpose of really wanting to enact or dismantle systems, right? And so we're not going to sanitize language, we're actually going to call out and be vulnerable about it, right? Leverage. And so that's also shared risk, because from my perspective, it's very different for us to have expectation for Black and brown chief diversity officers and advocates to do this than 80% or the 85% of white male CEOs. You know what I mean? Like, that's a different kind of risk. And so I think them leveraging their power, these CEOs leveraging their power, proximity to a lot of these spaces and rooms in a way, that's what a more effective, or at least a start point. FSG did a study around how organizations have prioritized racial justice, specifically racial justice. And so leveraging those best practices, right? And being okay with focusing on racial justice, because it's at its core, that is one of the more salient forms of oppression that our country continues to struggle with, right? And certainly all oppression is interconnected. But calling that out and addressing it, actually, so a couple months ago, I can't remember which firm it was or what organization it was, but there was like this program of those development programs that are for like when Black and brown people come into firms, and they're like, I guess I've never gone through one, but it's supposed to be some sort of enrichment or efficacy and kind of make sure that you're coming into the culture and
like an onboarding orientation program.
Yeah, but it's like guised as it's guised as such, but it's really like these assimilation camps, right?
Oh yeah, so they'll do that. They'll do that like in a lot of major consulting firms too. Like where basically you go to almost
it's a thing. It's a best practice.
It's a thing. Like it's almost like it's like a retreat. Like you go off.
And that's a problem. And it's so mainstream. And so I struggle with how even like the human resources industry, like as a system, has like perpetuates this with terms like culture fit and these development programs that are essentially saying you need to get in where you fit in if you want to survive or thrive, right? And have an action council have like a pillar that says, you know what, that's to assimilation camps. For the next 5 years, like we are going to, like, that's a structure to eliminate. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's something that we can collectively say we're going to focus on and not perpetuate anymore, right?
Well, I think like black and brown are just like non-majority employees. Like they die in between the rules, right? So like there are so many people that you can point to who didn't actually break any rules. Their performance is great. Like there's no documentation on them, but they just didn't fit, right? They just didn't, for unwritten reasons, they didn't fit. And when you talk about like when you start, like really marketing these assimilation type activities on a large scale and as best practice, they become informal best practices. So they're informal, but they're still best practices. So you, even though there's nothing, you haven't broken any rules, you're not doing anything against company policy, you're still not a fit. And so then it ends up excluding people who have the diversity of thought. Ironically, I'm using that term like literally. Yeah. Because
that's the thing too. If you do a search and find diversity of thought on their page, I think that's up there. I know that's how you were using it.
I wasn't. I was using it literally, but I hear you.
I know, but like it just made me think about it.
I do. I want to make sure that we give you some space to talk a little bit more about the Winners Group, right? So talk to us about the firm. For those in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, folks know about the Winners Group, but we have all types of listeners listening in. So please just talk to us a little bit more about the firm and what you do as an executive within the firm.
Sure. And so the Winners Group, we are a global diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. I've name dropped her quite a bit throughout this interview, but we were founded by Mary Frances Winter. She is still our president and CEO. And we support organizations large and small on their journey towards equity, inclusion, and justice. And so a lot of times that's supporting with cultural and equity audits. And so really interrogating the organization's culture and understanding how individuals' experiences are different based on who they are, right? Based on cultural norms, based on policies and practices that are inherently exclusive. And so a lot of times we are collecting data via qualitative means and quantitative means to really tell a story. And so we support in cultural and equity audits, obviously education and learning. And so that's where most of my work is. I work with a really bomb team of instructional designers, principal strategists, and facilitators and consultants to design learning experiences. I emphasize experiences. I shared earlier that I do not like the word training, and that we really seek to facilitate shifts in perspectives and paradigms in the spaces that we curate. And so, like I said, our approach and ideal partnerships are those that are long-term in nature and developmental, and so modules-based. And so sometimes we're blending in-person experiences with out-of-classroom peer-to-peer experiences. We'll leverage multimedia. We're really big on not perpetuating the emotional labor sort of power dynamic in some of this, some of what we see in education and learning. And so we leverage a lot of like multimedia. We really emphasize reciprocal learning so that it is a shared experience and not perpetuating power dynamics. A lot of our work is around building capacity. And so we've been doing more recently work around supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners and just continuing to hone their toolkit so that they can be effective in these systems, right? And so we do a lot around facilitating or empowering individuals to have conversations, difficult conversations across racial lines, other dimensions of difference. One of my babies, and so I'll be very honest and direct in saying that a lot of the conversations that I would like to have, we're not always having in some of these spaces. But that doesn't mean we don't have them at all. And so we leverage other mediums, our virtual learning labs and the inclusion solution as a way to ensure that our platforms are unpacking conversations that matter, right? And so power, we've talked about things like identity-based trauma, gentrification, cultural appropriation, how all of these things show up in our organizational systems. And even in just how we understand the work. Mary Frances is actually about to write a book on Black fatigue, right? Specifically in the context of moving this work forward.
Yeah.
And then we also support strategy development. And so we work directly with leaders who are really trying to figure out how to do this work and do this work well and mindfully and be not just committed, but actually engaged in it. And so we support organizations with strategy development. So that's the work. Love the team. Love working for a Black woman. Anytime I have the opportunity to show up on behalf of the Winters Group, and then just on behalf of just being Black and like in these spaces and having access, I don't take it lightly, right? I have one thing I didn't share in my bio is that I'm a mom to a Black son. And so there's a certain degree of it. As much as I'm cynical about this work, there's also a certain degree of like urgency that I experience in this work because, quite frankly, we don't unfortunately have the luxury of like kind of not doing this work. It's our humanity. It's life or death. It ain't just business case, y'all. I think about that and what it means to realize a world where my Black son, at least doesn't have to feel the after effects of white supremacy the same way his grandfather and great grandfather and uncle and brother has something's got to change. And so this work something does. In my profession is an extension of that too, right?
No, something does have to change because, it is just interesting. Like I said at the top, like there's these studies coming out about the increased lack of diversity. And we talked about the fact that like we're at a point now where it's like, well, it just kind of is what it is, right? Like, similar to like the Oscars and the Grammys. It's just like, okay, well, we know. We just know that Black, that we're not going to be represented here, and we're going to continue to, kind of continue on business as usual. But that's just not sustainable. And I think about the fact that, I'm going to be a parent too. And I think about like the fact that there is a future generation, right? Like that officially starts my ticking clock on. I'm only going to be here so long. And so what does it really look like to make sure that there's a world for them that is recognizable? So they're not looking like,
I hate to say it, I hope I don't sound ridiculous, I don't know who this man is. I mean, he could be walking down the street, I wouldn't know a thing. Sorry to this man.
You know, sorry to this man, I don't know what, you know.
Like, so even, so I'll say this one thing, and so another reason why I'm just as passionate about this work is there's even like intra-group work that needs to be done that I'm passionate about.
Yes.
And so work around just like healing ourselves and pouring into ourselves and our inherent power, agency, internalized oppression, like all of those things that influence our system, that sort of take root in us, that influence the system in really jacked up ways.
Straight up. One day we gotta come. We gotta have you. And maybe, you know what I'm saying, maybe we'll even have, Mary Frances Winters, on the platform. But talk about internalized oppression and, like, the role that it plays in perpetuating these systems that oppress us, right? Because, like, it's rare, like, and I keep on shouting out Howard Bryant, but, like, it's rare because there's not a lot of black and brown folks that I see, like, in senior levels who will really speak truth to power. Because, like, I'm telling you, I don't know if I've met one person, if I've been in an organization, and let's say, because I've moved around, like, my career has been a zigzag, upward zigzag, by the grace of God, and we do thank Him.
That's when the blessings come in. Blessings come in.
You know what I'm saying? But it's been a blessing, so thank you, and I do respect you. Thank you, God. But when I go to another company and I see a black person and let's say they've been at the company for more than like 6 years, 99.999% of the time, they will not be boldly advocating for black people.
So there's this book, Race, Work, and Leadership, New Perspectives on the Black Experience, edited by the lead editor is a black woman, Laura Morgan Roberts. In this book, there's a collection of studies, one of which interrogates this dynamic that you're talking about and the effectiveness of black leaders in white spaces. In that study, they offer this matrix of out-group identification, and so the extent to which the black person identifies with, in this context, the out-group white people, and sort of in-group sort of identity and pride, right? And they offer examples of leaders who had one but not the other, right? And then leaders who were effective because they had both, and how more often than not the norm is that there is more prioritization of identifying with white people and the white culture and the dominant culture than it is with understanding self and being grounded and having a foundation in self, that oftentimes lead to them being complicit in these systems. And so the study is good because it pretty much names and substantiates pretty much what you just said and we experience in these spaces, calls it out, and then offers a model of what could be. Because what we're not going to say is that, what I don't like to perpetuate is, the only way we can get in where we fit in is if we are complicit and assimilate. I don't believe that to be true. And this study shows that it.
But folks believe that, and they tout it as wisdom.
Yeah, right? and that's internalized oppression is real.
And then
right?
And meanwhile, so then you got folks who look like us, and folks who don't look like us, both oppressing us, and they both sit at the table like,
look at us. Hey, look at us. Look at us. Huh? Who would have thought? Not me.
They just
like. But you know what the thing is, and we're gonna have to. There's another video out there where Malcolm X is addressing so much to be learned from history. God, like none of this is new. But Malcolm X is addressing a university audience. He talks about the ways in which white people leverage black people as tools to push their narrative and like influence. Like he talks about that in the context of that day and age. And as I was watching the video, I thought about how powerful it would be if we leveraged a lot of these stories. And this stuff is not new, right? This stuff isn't new. Sankofa is real if we were to actually leverage it. to do better. I don't know what that looks like. And I think about even what that looks like in the context of diversity, education, and learning. Like, how do we embed history, because they ain't getting it in the school system, a little bit more into the work that we're doing? A conversation for another day. But a lot of people just don't know. A lot of people don't know. And I'm talking about us, unfortunately, because we are not immune to the forces of white supremacy and whiteness and racism, obviously. And I think until we focus, I think there is a work required of us, among us, for us, that centers us, that needs to be done. And as much as we are, doing this other work to educate white people. So we need both. I have a lot more grace for the work that we need to be doing as a community, because I recognize the trauma and pain is real. Which is a whole nother conversation. It
is. And this has been incredible. I wanna go ahead and end this conversation on that.
I know.
You know what I'm saying? Because we've been going, but it's been great though.
I know.
I want to just thank you. Y'all, thank y'all for listening to the Living Corporate Podcast. We do this every single week. We come into y'all with new guests every single week. Now look, I need y'all to help me with these 5-star reviews, okay? Because you think it's easy for us to come up here, find these guests, put these questions together, coordinate them. I'm not making myself out to be a martyr, but at the same time,
what more do you want from me?
But replace me with us. You know what I mean? We out here, okay? Nah, I'm playing. I love y'all, and we appreciate y'all. You've been listening to Brittany Harris, VP of Learning and Innovation, and all things freedom and liberation. What's up? At the Winners Group. And you make sure you check us out at www.living-corporate, please say the dash.com, livingcorporate.co, livingcorporate.us, livingcorporate.net, livingcorporate.org. Okay? We have all the Living Corporate except livingcorporate.com, so don't go there, because you're going to go there and you're going to see some corporate apartment website and you're going to get upset with me. So I'm telling you, living-corporate, please say the dash.com, or livingcorporate.anything-but.com. Okay. Make sure you check us out on Instagram at Living Corporate. Make sure you check us on Twitter at livingcorp_pod. Until next time, peace.
Living Corporate is a podcast by Living Corporate LLC. Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin from Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.